Picture this: you're galloping through dense forests under the cover of night, the weight of a kingdom's future pressed against your chest. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every snapped twig a warning. Your mission: to deliver a single piece of parchment, a message so vital that its arrival could mean victory or ruin. This wasn't just a job, it was a life or death gamble, one that medieval messengers faced every time they mounted their horses. These weren't just couriers, they were the lifelines of empires, the invisible threads stitching together the fractured realms of kings and warlords. And the stakes, nothing less than the fate of nations. Take the story of one nameless rider during the 100 Years' War, who carved through hostile lands with an arrow lodged in his shoulder, clutching a dispatch that would rally an entire army. He wasn't a knight in shining armor, yet his courage altered the course of battle. What kind of person risks everything for words on a page? What loyalty or desperation drove them forward when every mile threatened betrayal? These messengers didn't just carry letters, they carried secrets, treaties, and sometimes the hopes of entire peoples. Their tales are etched not in grand monuments, but in the silent margins of history, where the true weight of their sacrifices lingers. This is the world we're stepping into, a realm where trust was as fragile as parchment and bravery was measured in miles crossed under threat of death. Over the next minutes, we'll unravel the stories of these unsung heroes, the men and women who navigated treachery, weather, and war to keep the wheels of power turning. You'll meet the spy who posed as a minstrel, the queen's confidante who outran assassins, and the peasant whose loyalty defied kings. Their legacies aren't just footnotes, they're proof that sometimes history hinges not on swords, but on the ones who dared to deliver the words that swung them. So saddle up, we're riding into the heart of their world, where every message was a gamble and every messenger a legend in the making. In a world where news traveled at the speed of a horse's gallop, messengers were the beating heart of medieval politics and war. Without them, kings would rule blind, armies would march deaf, and alliances would crumble into rumors. These couriers bridged the vast silences between castles and battlefields, carrying everything from royal decrees to desperate pleas for reinforcements. A single delay could mean a fortress falling, a rebellion succeeding, or a truce arriving too late. Their work wasn't just about delivering letters, it was about holding the fragile threads of power together. Some messengers were humble servants, their names lost to time, tasked with trudging through mud and snow to reach their destinations. Others rode with the authority of kings themselves, like the trusted knights who negotiated treaties on the spot, or the diplomats who carried seals of absolute trust. Status didn't shield them from danger, though. A messenger's cloak might mark them as a target just as easily as it signaled their importance. Bandits stalked lonely roads, eager to intercept valuable secrets. Winter storms could swallow whole parties without a trace. Even crossing into friendly territory was no guarantee of safety. Spies lurked everywhere, and a single bribe could turn a loyal guard into a deadly threat. Yet these risks only underscored how crucial their role was. Imagine a battlefield where commanders had no way to coordinate movements, or a kingdom where laws took months to reach its farthest corners. Messengers made the medieval world function not just as carriers, but as the living, breathing network that kept chaos at bay. And the most astonishing part, many of them chose this life knowing full well the perils that came with it. What drove them wasn't just duty, it was the unshakable belief that their missions mattered. Whether they were peasants with nothing to lose or nobles with everything to protect, they rode anyway, because in a world without whispers or wires, someone had to be the voice in the dark. That relentless courage sets the stage for the stories that follow, tales of messengers who didn't just face danger, but stared it down with ingenuity and sheer grit. Some disguised themselves as pilgrims or merchants, slipping past enemy lines with coded messages sewn into their clothes. Others raced against time, pushing their horses to collapse to outrun pursuers. Their exploits weren't just about survival, they were about rewriting fate, one desperate ride at a time. Among the most daring of these medieval messengers was a man known only as Jacques, a low-born courier whose wits proved sharper than any sword. In the bitter winter of 1421, with France and England locked in the 100 Years' War, Jacques was tasked with delivering urgent orders to a besieged French garrison, orders that had to cross 30 miles of English-held territory. Carrying written words would have been a death sentence if searched, so Jacques sewed coded symbols into the lining of his pilgrim's robe, stitching them among faded, embroidered crosses. To any patrol, he was just another weary traveler seeking blessings at a distant shrine. But hidden in plain sight was a map of enemy positions and a single phrase, repeated in knots along the hem: "The fox digs at moonrise." Chronicles from the time describe how Jacques perfected his role, chanting psalms with convincing piety while mentally rehearsing every detail of his false identity. When stopped by English soldiers near Amiens, he offered them bread from his pouch and spoke of a sick sister waiting at a monastery, a story layered with just enough grief to discourage further questions. His greatest test came at a guarded bridge where sentries demanded proof of his pilgrimage. Without hesitation, Jacques pulled a vial of holy water from his belt, actually river water blessed by a friendly priest days earlier, and trickled it across his forehead in the sign of the cross. The superstitious guards let him pass without another word. The message he delivered changed everything. That coded phrase alerted the French garrison to attack the English supply wagons under cover of darkness, exploiting a lunar eclipse the enemy hadn't anticipated. Within a week, the siege collapsed. A contemporary chronicler, Jean Froissart, later wrote, "The courage of one man in a pilgrim's cloak did more to break that siege than 100 knights in armor." Jacques' story reveals the unspoken truth of medieval espionage. Survival depended not on strength but on theater. Every glance, every gesture had to sell the lie. Could you have kept your nerve as Jacques did, knowing a single slip meant torture or execution? His success hinged on something deeper than disguise. It required inhabiting his role so completely that doubt never touched his eyes. While kings and generals plotted wars, it was messengers like Jacques who turned those plans into reality, armed with nothing but audacity and a talent for deception. And his legacy endures as a masterclass in the art of invisible warfare, where the most powerful weapon wasn't a blade but a well-told story. Now imagine running until your lungs burned and your legs gave out, not for glory, but because a single hour's delay could doom hundreds. Such was the life of the messenger known as Roland of Provas, whose legendary sprint through the Alpine foothills in 1463 became the stuff of ballads. Tasked with warning the Duke of Savoy of an approaching Burgundian army, Roland covered nearly 50 miles of rugged terrain in less than a day. By the time he stumbled through the castle gates, his boots were shredded, his feet bloodied, and his voice reduced to a croak, but his message arrived in time. The Duke's forces raised the drawbridge just as enemy scouts appeared on the horizon. Without Roland's sacrifice, the castle would have fallen before dawn. What made these messengers push their bodies beyond breaking point? There were no medals for speed, no promises of reward, only the knowledge that failure meant slaughter. Chroniclers wrote of couriers who collapsed from exhaustion mid-ride, their horses dying beneath them. Others succumbed to exposure in mountain passes or were ambushed within sight of their destination. Roland himself reportedly slept for 3 days after his run, his body so broken that healers feared he'd never walk again. Yet when asked why he risked it, his answer echoed countless unnamed couriers. Someone had to. The contrast to today's world couldn't be starker. Where we tap screens to send words across continents in seconds, medieval messengers traded in lifeblood for every mile. Their feats were measured not in clicks, but in grit-blistered hands gripping reins, frostbitten cheeks pressed against the wind. Small wonder their stories became legend. Troubadours sang of Roland's run as though he'd raced the devil himself, spinning tales of how the saints guided his steps. In truth, his strength came from something far more human, the unshakable resolve of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary moments. But speed wasn't always enough. For every Roland who outran danger, there were messengers who faced a crueler test not of their legs but of their loyalty. When the stakes weren't just time but temptation, betrayal could lurk behind every tree. Not all messengers wore their loyalty like armor. Some carried secrets not for crowns but for coin, and few fell further than Pierre de Clermont, the knight-turned traitor whose betrayal left scars on 15th century France. By day, he was a trusted courier for King Charles VII, entrusted with sensitive dispatches between Paris and Bordeaux. By night, he sold those very letters to the highest bidder, sometimes to the English, sometimes to rebellious nobles, always to whoever lined his pockets with silver. His downfall came when a coded note meant for the Duke of Burgundy was intercepted, revealing his double game. The king's spymasters had long suspected a leak, but even they were stunned to find the traitor among their inner circle. What drives a man to trade honor for gold? Historical accounts suggest Pierre's motives were a toxic mix of greed and resentment. Despite his noble blood, he'd been passed over for land grants and titles, watching lesser men rise while he remained a glorified errand runner. The final insult came when a rival was named to a lucrative post Pierre had coveted. A messenger is only as valuable as the messages he carries. He reportedly sneered before his execution. His bitterness cost thousands of lives. Deliberately misrouted French reinforcements led to the massacre at Castellan in 1453, where English longbowmen slaughtered entire companies lured into a trap by false intelligence. Yet Pierre's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Messengers held power far beyond their station. A single altered phrase could redirect armies. A delayed letter could starve a city into surrender. For those willing to cross moral lines, that leverage became currency. Chroniclers noted how often turncoats like Pierre shared a trait they'd seen first and how fragile royal trust really was. After years of witnessing kings break promises or discard loyal servants, some decided loyalty was just another bargain, one they could renegotiate. Would you have resisted that temptation? Imagine holding a parchment that could buy you a new life or doom a kingdom. The pressure cracked even hardened men. After Pierre's capture, interrogators found a ledger detailing payments from 5 different lords. His last words before the hangman's noose tightened: "I carried their lies until I learned to profit by them." His legacy became a cautionary tale, forcing monarchs to devise elaborate safeguards, split messages across multiple couriers, cipher systems changed weekly, and punishments so brutal they turned treason into a gamble with one's very soul. This shadow war of trust and treachery set the stage for messengers who faced an even grimmer test, not of greed, but of endurance under torment. Because when kings couldn't buy silence, they sought to break it. Some messengers faced trials that went beyond exhaustion or betrayal. They stared into the abyss of human cruelty and refused to blink. Take the case of Mateo of Lombardy, a courier seized by Milanese forces in 1489 while carrying coded letters for the Venetian Republic. His captors didn't just want the messages, they wanted the cipher, the key to unraveling an entire spy network. What followed was a grim education in medieval interrogation. First came the strappado, a pulley system that dropped Mateo from a height, his arms wrenched behind him until shoulders dislocated. When he still refused to talk, they pressed heated coins to his eyelids, a torture designed to leave no visible scars but inflict unbearable agony. What separates Mateo's story from others is not just his suffering, but his ingenuity under duress. Between sessions, he memorized every guard rotation, every careless word dropped by his jailers. Feigning delirium from pain, he babbled nonsense phrases that hinted at false meeting places, sending Milanese troops chasing shadows through the countryside. Meanwhile, the real Venetian agents, warned by Mateo's prolonged silence, vanished into new safe houses. A surviving letter from the Milanese captain fumes. The prisoner speaks only in riddles, as if his very screams are lies. The most chilling detail, Mateo's resistance wasn't unique. Medieval chronicles overflow with accounts of messengers biting off their own tongues to avoid betraying secrets, or swallowing wax capsules containing messages rather than letting them be seized. A Franciscan monk writing in 1494 described one such courier simply as a man who understood that some truths are worth more than flesh. That stark phrase captures the brutal calculus these messengers faced, physical destruction versus moral collapse, yet even in darkness, humanity flickered. Jailers sometimes noted how tortured couriers recited prayers or fragments of poetry to endure the pain, not for divine intervention, but to anchor their minds to something beyond the dungeon. Mateo reportedly whispered the same line from Dante's Inferno each night. "Consider your origins, you were not made to live as brutes." When he was finally ransomed after 6 months, emaciated and permanently blinded in one eye, his first act was to dictate everything he'd learned about Milan's defenses to Venetian scribes. Could you have held fast as Mateo did? His story forces us to confront the outer limits of loyalty, where devotion transforms into something almost superhuman. These messengers didn't just risk death, they willingly entered hell itself to protect the words entrusted to them. And sometimes, against all odds, they emerged victorious, like the young woman who turned her captor's arrogance into her greatest weapon. The legend of Guillaume de Montferrat reads like something torn from an epic poem, a messenger whose survival against impossible odds made even hardened knights whisper of divine favor. In the autumn of 1398, Guillaume was entrusted with a plea for reinforcements from the besieged city of Orleans. His path, a gauntlet of English archers and mercenary bands, all hungry to intercept any word from the desperate French garrison. Within hours of setting out, an arrow meant for his heart struck instead the small wooden cross hanging from his neck, shattering the relic but leaving him unharmed. By dusk, he'd forded a river swollen with rain just before it collapsed into a flash flood. And when bandits ambushed him at a narrow pass, his horse, reared on the steep hills of Provas, leaped clean over their heads, an act so improbable that later chroniclers claimed angels lifted its hooves. What transforms a man into a figure of myth? Guillaume's journey shows how thin the line was between mortal and legend in the medieval mind. Villagers along his route swore they saw a spectral knight riding beside him, deflecting arrows with an invisible shield. A baker in Blois insisted Guillaume's shadow stretched unnaturally long at midday, as if something otherworldly trailed him. The truth was likely simpler, a mix of uncanny luck, wilderness savvy, and sheer desperation. Yet in an age where every lightning strike could be God's wrath and every healed wound a miracle, survival itself became proof of divine favor. When Guillaume finally staggered into the Duke of Berry's hall, his tunic stiff with dried blood and mud, even the Duke knelt to kiss the remnants of that shattered cross. Modern survival stories echo these themes: hikers lost for weeks who defy starvation, sailors adrift in storms who outlast the waves. But Guillaume's world lacked satellite beacons or emergency rations. His tools were a dagger, a waterskin, and the terrible understanding that failure meant thousands would die. That weight forged a resilience bordering on supernatural. After delivering his message, he collapsed into a fever so severe that monks prepared his last rites only for him to rise 3 days later, demanding a fresh horse. The Duke, astonished, asked how he'd endured. Guillaume's reply, "The dead do not deliver messages." Such tales remind us that history's most vital moments often hinged on individuals who refused to perish. Yet for every Guillaume who cheated death, there were those whose single misstep unraveled empires, because sometimes the greatest danger wasn't an arrow or a storm, but a moment's hesitation at the wrong crossroads. History remembers the triumphs of messengers like Guillaume and Mateo, but sometimes the most revealing lessons come from those who couldn't outrun fate. Consider the bitter winter of 1476, when a single delayed rider doomed the great Burgundian alliance against France. Duke Charles the Bold had spent months negotiating secret pacts with Italian mercenaries and German lords, all timed to strike the French simultaneously. His final plea for coordination, entrusted to a veteran courier named Henry, who'd navigated a dozen wars without incident, but this time fate intervened. A freak blizzard buried Alpine passes under 15 feet of snow, forcing Henry to abandon his horse and proceed on foot. By the time he stumbled into the German camp half-frozen, his satchel of letters reduced to pulp by melted snow, the attack date had come and gone. The German forces, assuming Burgundy had betrayed them, disbanded. The Italians, left vulnerable, were crushed by French cavalry. Within weeks, Charles's grand strategy lay in ruins. The cruel irony: Henry had done everything right. He'd taken the safest route, avoided known bandit haunts, even sacrificed his mount rather than risk its death blocking the path. But in an era where nature held veto power over human plans, no amount of skill could conquer a storm. Chroniclers noted how Charles raged not at Henry, but at the heavens themselves, screaming at the snow-choked skies. The disaster exposed a truth medieval rulers hated to admit. Their power ended where the weather began. Roads turned to rivers in spring rains. Summer droughts left horses too weak to gallop. Even the moon's phase could decide a message's fate. Full light aided night riders, but also made them easier prey for ambushes. Human error proved just as deadly. In 1389, a Welsh archer turned messenger missed a critical turn near Agincourt, delivering his lord's plea for reinforcements to the wrong castle. By the time the mistake was uncovered, the battle was lost. Another courier, racing to warn of a Viking raid in the 9th century, drowned crossing a deceptively calm river, his body found weeks later, the warning still sealed in his pouch. These weren't tales of cowardice or incompetence, but of a world where communication balanced on a knife's edge. A twisted ankle, a snapped bridge, even a well-meaning innkeeper who offered one too many ales could unravel kingdoms. Yet for every fatal delay, there arose messengers who defied the impossible not through luck, but through sheer, unrelenting will. Like the woman who swam a moat under arrow fire to reach a besieged tower, or the monk who walked barefoot through bandit country, his sandals stuffed with coded letters. Their stories remind us that while the medieval world was fragile, the human spirit wasn't. And in the shadows of history's near misses, their legends burned all the brighter. War declarations traveled not on the wind, but in the hands of men who knew their words would set fields ablaze. Few understood this better than Thomas de Courcy. the English herald who rode into Paris in 1337 with a message so incendiary, the French king's guards initially refused to let him speak. The parchment he carried wasn't just a notice of war. It was a performance, a calculated act of psychological theater. Gilded with the royal seal and penned in blood-red ink, its opening lines invoked divine judgment before listing grievances like a prosecutor's indictment. Every flourish of the scribe's quill had been designed to unsettle, from the exaggerated spacing between accusations to the ominous blank space left where the French king's reply should be. Heralds like Thomas weren't mere couriers, they were living symbols of their sovereign's wrath. Dressed in tabards blazoned with their master's coat of arms, they delivered declarations with ritual precision. Records from the period describe how Thomas stood motionless as the French court read his message, his face a mask even as nobles drew daggers in outrage. Protocol demanded he remain untouched, but the air vibrated with threats. One chronicler noted how the herald's gloved hand never trembled as he accepted the French king's counter-challenge, though the parchment he received bore fresh wax still warm enough to burn. The power of such messages lay in their unflinching finality. Unlike battlefield taunts or diplomatic feints, these were words that could not be unspoken. When the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Roman II sent a declaration to the Ottomans in 1402, his scribes embedded thin gold threads into the parchment, a silent reminder that war would drain both nations' treasuries. The Sultan's response arrived on paper mixed with crushed rubies, a glittering metaphor for the blood soon to be spilled. These weren't just announcements, they were the first strokes of a coming storm. Yet for all their defiance, the messengers who delivered them often walked a razor's edge. In 1511, a Spanish herald presenting a war declaration to the Navarrese court was forced to stand for 12 hours without food or water while nobles debated whether to hang him as a spy. His survival hinged on a technicality, the medieval equivalent of diplomatic immunity, but the incident exposed the raw nerve these envoys pressed. They embodied the very conflicts they proclaimed, human lightning rods for centuries of grudges. What transformed these moments from mere formalities into history's turning points? The answer lies in the messenger's dual role as both shield and sword. Their presence made war inevitable, yet their sacred status as conduits of truth forced rulers to confront the consequences of their ambitions. When the Duke of Burgundy received an English declaration in 1420, his advisors noted how he stared at the herald's boots caked with mud from hard riding before murmuring, "So this is how it begins." But just as messengers could unleash wars, they also held the keys to ending them. Behind every blood-stained proclamation lay the unspoken truth. The same roads that carried threats could also bear olive branches. Among the rarest and most revered of medieval messengers were those who carried not declarations of war, but fragile offerings of peace, and none wielded words more skillfully than Isabella of Aragon. In 1488, this Spanish noblewoman rode alone into the rebel-held city of Granada, her saddlebags filled not with weapons but with pomegranates, a symbol of the fertile lands both sides were bleeding to possess. The rebels had slaughtered the last 3 royal envoys, leaving their heads on pikes outside the city gates. Yet Isabella dismounted without armor, lifting her veil to show her face as she offered fruit to the nearest guard. "A gift," she said in flawless Arabic, "from those who remember when these orchards fed us all." Diplomatic messengers like Isabella operated in a realm beyond mere survival. Every word, every gesture carried weight. Where war heralds projected unshakable resolve, peacemakers had to master a subtler art, listening for the unspoken fears behind a rival's bluster, spotting the momentary hesitation when a warlord's hand hovered over a treaty. Chroniclers noted how Isabella mirrored the Granadan rebels' posture during negotiations, echoing their proverbs while gently steering conversations toward common ground. When talks stalled over water rights, she produced a shared relic, a centuries-old irrigation map proving both communities once shared wells. "The earth remembers what men forget," she murmured as fingers traced the faded parchment. The tools of their trade were as nuanced as their tactics. Silk-wrapped olive branches signaled honorable intentions, while the choice of messenger could speak volumes, sending a bishop to a devout opponent, or a battle-scarred knight to a warlord who respected martial prowess. Some carried passport rings engraved with sovereign seals, granting safe passage. Others, like Isabella, relied on theatrical humility, arriving in dust-stained robes to emphasize shared hardships. A surviving account from the Granada archives describes how she won over the rebel leader's wife by admiring her embroidery, a seemingly casual moment that became the key to private negotiations away from the men's posturing. What separated these peacemakers from their sword-wielding counterparts wasn't just courage, but emotional intelligence centuries ahead of its time. They knew when to invoke scripture or poetry, when to let silence do the arguing, even when to stage calculated outbursts like the French monk who shattered a goblet during truce talks to shock quarreling nobles into stillness. Their success rates were shockingly high for the era. Records suggest nearly 1 in 3 armed conflicts were halted or delayed by messenger diplomats, though most names are lost to history. Could modern diplomats learn from their playbook? While jets have replaced horses and emails stand in for parchment, the core challenges remain eerily familiar: building trust across enemy lines, decoding cultural nuances, knowing when a small gesture outweighs grand speeches. Isabella's pomegranates find their echo in today's symbolic state dinners and carefully chosen gifts. Yet these medieval peacemakers also understood something we often forget: survival depended on more than eloquence. Their saddlebags held more than treaties, they carried the tricks of their trade. Hidden compartments held counterfeit seals to fool bandits. Hollowed-out staffs concealed emergency funds. Some memorized multiple cipher systems, changing codes daily to outwit interceptors. After all, the messenger who ended a war still had to live long enough to deliver the news. A scrap of parchment could topple a kingdom if it fell into the wrong hands, which is why medieval messengers didn't just carry letters. They weaponized them with layers of deception. Take the case of the Venetian cipher wheel, a palm-sized brass disc that scrambled words into nonsense unless aligned with an identical twin held by the recipient. Spin the inner ring 3 notches to the right, and "attack at dawn" became "ZRRQBXQGJDZO," gibberish to any interceptors, but the most ingenious codes played psychological games. During the War of the Roses, Lancastrian messengers sewed tiny silver threads into the hems of their cloaks, a signal to allies that their spoken words were lies meant for eavesdropping Yorkist spies. The truth, written in lemon juice between the lines of harmless shopping lists, revealed only when held over a candle's flame. Some codes were so effective they outlived their creators. The Duke's Alphabet, a cipher system used by Burgundy's spies in the 1450s, stumped codebreakers for centuries until a historian in 1923 noticed its symbols matched the constellations above Brussels on the Duke's birthday. Others relied on brutal simplicity. Scottish clans sent messengers with heather tucked behind their ears. If the sprig was fresh, it signaled safe passage, but withered blooms warned of ambushes ahead. The Byzantines took it further, training messenger parrots to speak phrases in Armenian or Georgian, languages few enemies could decipher. Yet for all their ingenuity, medieval encryption shared one flaw with today's digital firewalls: human error. In 1407, a Florentine diplomat's careless doodling on a coded letter inadvertently recreated the cipher key, handing Milanese spies access to a decade's worth of secrets. Similarly, modern hackers exploit weak passwords much like medieval bandits targeted messengers who reused obvious symbols. A reminder that the weakest link in security has always been the person holding the key. The parallels don't end there. Modern email encryption mirrors the Venetian practice of splitting messages across multiple couriers, while blockchain verification echoes the wax seals that once proved a parchment's authenticity. Even steganography hiding data in plain sight has ancient roots. A 15th century French spy named Marguerite Lafortune encoded battle plans in the embroidery patterns of her gowns, just as today's cyber spies embed data in digital images. But no code could shield messengers from the relentless toll of their journeys. Behind every cipher wheel and invisible ink recipe lay a more visceral challenge, surviving the miles, the weather, and the ever-present specter of exhaustion. Because when your body is the final firewall between a secret and its enemies, fatigue becomes the ultimate vulnerability. The roads medieval messengers traveled weren't just paths, they were gauntlets. Imagine knee-deep mud swallowing boots whole in spring, dust-choking lungs in summer, and winter turning every mountain pass into a frozen death trap. A route we'd cover by car in 2 hours could take weeks when rivers swelled over bridges or when wolves prowled too close to the tree line. Forests weren't scenic backdrops, they were labyrinths of shadow where bandits waited and bears prowled. Even the shelters were hazards, ramshackle inns with flea-infested straw, or worse, the hospices run by monks where the sick coughed blood into shared basins. Disease spread faster than news, and a single infected bite from a roadside inn's bedbugs could leave a messenger feverish and lost in delirium by dawn. Yet the greatest threat wasn't nature, it was isolation. Modern travelers carry phones, maps, roadside assistance. Medieval couriers had only the stars, unreliable mile markers, and rumors from the last terrified peddler they'd passed. One wrong turn could strand them in marshes where will-o'-the-wisps lured the desperate to drown. Outlaws knew this too, ambushing stragglers at known bottlenecks like the infamous Holloway near Gloucester, where the narrow path forced riders into single file, perfect for a rope strung at neck height. Some messengers wore padded collars not for warmth, but as makeshift armor against such traps. The sheer physical toll would break most people today. Riding 30 miles on a medieval saddle, hard leather with minimal padding left riders so chafed they could barely walk. Chroniclers wrote of couriers arriving with legs raw as butcher's meat, their thighs crusted with blood and sweat. And when horses foundered, as they often did, messengers continued on foot. The Burgundian chronicler Chaselain described one such man who walked the last 18 miles to Dijon barefoot, his boots having disintegrated in a hailstorm, his soles so calloused they clattered like hooves on the cobbles. But for all its horrors, this brutal network birthed legends, especially those who defied expectations. Like Alay de Clisson, the blacksmith's daughter who disguised herself as a wool merchant's apprentice to carry warnings of an English raid. Women weren't supposed to ride alone, let alone cross war zones, but Alay used prejudice as her camouflage. When stopped by soldiers near Poitiers, she leaned into their laughter at her delicate hands, pretending to faint at the sight of their daggers. By the time they realized those hands could strangle a man with his own reins, she'd already slipped into the night with her message sewn into her braid. Her story, like so many others, proves that the toughest terrain wasn't the land, it was the limits others tried to impose. History remembers Matilda of Artois not for the lands she owned or the children she bore, but for the 3 nights she spent lashed to a saddle, racing through hostile territory with her hair cropped like a boy's and a stolen soldier's cloak hiding her shape. In the spring of 1328, with her husband's castle under siege, Matilda took the most dangerous gamble of her life. she disguised herself as a stable hand and slipped past enemy lines with a plea for help sewn into the hem of her tunic. What made her story extraordinary wasn't just the disguise, or even the 60 miles she covered in 2 days. It was the sheer audacity of her choice at a time when women's roles were rigidly scripted. A contemporary monk's chronicle sputters with outrage. A noblewoman debasing herself like a common knave, her unbound limbs a scandal against God's order. Yet that same account grudgingly admits her success. Matilda's message brought a relief force that broke the siege. Female messengers like Matilda operated in a world that saw them as either invisible or incendiary. Some, like the Italian widow Beatrice, exploited societal blindness, dressing in mourning veils to move unchallenged through checkpoints, their summer robes hiding maps drawn on silk handkerchiefs. Others flaunted their femininity as a weapon. Joan of Navarre, sent to negotiate a truce in 1403, deliberately arrived in a gown slashed to reveal a dagger strapped to her thigh. "Let them whisper about my legs," she reportedly told her squire. "It means they're not watching my hands." The risks they faced went beyond bandits and bad weather. A man caught carrying messages might be ransomed. A woman risked far darker fates, from forced marriage to accusations of witchcraft. Yet the historical record hints at countless untold stories. How many peasant women carried warnings of approaching armies as they herded sheep? How many nuns passed coded letters in their illuminated manuscripts? A fragmentary poem from Aquitaine praises an unnamed lady of the marshes who waded through reeds for 3 days to warn a monastery of Viking raiders, only to vanish from official accounts, her name erased by scribes who couldn't reconcile her heroism with their worldview. This tension between faith and duty shaped many messengers' lives. Monasteries often served as relay stations, their scriptoria perfect covers for copying sensitive documents. Brother Heinrich of Cluny famously walked barefoot from Paris to Rome with papal letters hidden in his begging bowl, surviving on crusts and rainwater. But even holy orders balked at female counterparts. When Sister Claire of Metz disguised herself as a friar to deliver warnings of a coming siege, her own abbess later burned the evidence, fearing the scandal. "Better men think we all perished than know one of us played the harlot in Hose," the abbess wrote, a chilling reminder of how quickly society punished women who stepped beyond prescribed roles. Perhaps that's why so many of these stories surface only in fragments. A line in a tax record noting payment to "the widow who rode by night," a faded fresco in a Tuscan chapel showing a hooded figure on horseback, the face suspiciously delicate beneath the paint. Their legacies linger in the margins, where defiance briefly flickered before the parchment closed over them. But in those fleeting moments, they proved messages didn't need swords to be dangerous. Sometimes, all they required was a woman willing to carry them. When danger lurked behind every tree and brigands haunted the crossroads, medieval messengers often turned to higher powers for protection. St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, became their celestial guardian, his image carved into wooden pendants, embroidered on cloak linings, even scratched into the wax seals of urgent dispatches. To ride alone through the wilderness was to flirt with mortality, and faith offered both comfort and strategy. A messenger setting out from Lyon might kiss a relic of the saint's tooth before departure, while another in Prague tucked a parchment scrap inscribed with Psalm 91 into his boot. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. These devotions weren't just symbolic, they were survival tactics. Chroniclers recorded cases like that of Brother Ansgar, a Benedictine courier whose horse stumbled upon a wolf pack in the Black Forest. According to his later testimony, the beast circled but refused to attack, their eyes fixed on the silver St. Christopher medal swinging from the saddle. Skeptics might dismiss it as luck, but in an era where faith and fact blurred, such stories became armor for the mind. Even practical men carried charms, bundles of vervain herb to ward off evil, iron nails blessed by priests to repel witchcraft, or vials of thunderwater, rain collected during storms, believed to hold divine power. The line between prayer and superstition often vanished on the road. In Normandy, messengers whispered the names of 3 archangels when crossing rivers, a practice borrowed from Old Norse incantations. Bavarian riders tied red thread around their wrists, a custom echoing pagan blood oaths, now sanctified by hastily muttered Hail Marys. This fusion of traditions reflected a deeper truth. When your life depended on unseen forces, you didn't debate theology. You grabbed every spiritual weapon within reach. Then there were the miracles, or at least events so inexplicable they demanded divine explanation. Take the account of Rodrigo, a Spanish courier who in 1412 plunged into a frozen ravine while evading Moorish scouts. His body should have shattered on the rocks below. Instead, he awoke hours later in a shepherd's hut, his satchel of letters dry and intact despite the icy stream swirling around him. The shepherd swore he'd seen a figure in a brown robe, St. Francis, perhaps, dragging Rodrigo from the water. The story spread like wildfire, and soon messengers across Castile pinned tiny brown cloth squares to their tunics, a makeshift homage to the saint's habit. Yet for all their heavenly intercessors, these riders still answered to earthly masters, because when a message arrived at a king's chamber, faith alone couldn't shield you from royal temper or courtly intrigue. A king's message could arrive with more than words sometimes. It thundered into foreign courts atop elephants, draped in cloth of gold. Medieval messengers didn't just deliver scrolls, they orchestrated spectacles designed to dazzle, intimidate, or seduce rival rulers. Consider the year 1403, when the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Roman II sent a delegation to Venice bearing a gift so extravagant it silenced the notoriously gossipy court, a relic purported to be the entire skeletal hand of John the Baptist, encased in a crystal reliquary studded with sapphires the size of quail eggs. But the true masterpiece was the messenger himself, a eunuch scholar who recited the saint's miracles in flawless Latin, Greek, and Arabic, subtly underscoring Byzantium's cultural supremacy. The Doge's advisors, who'd planned to reject Manuel's plea for military aid, reportedly exchanged uneasy glances as the scholar knelt, presenting the relic with a whisper, "He who baptized kings now greets you." Gifts were geopolitical chess moves disguised as generosity. When the Mongol Khan Kublai sent Marco Polo's father back to Europe with a simple block of jade in 1271, Venetian gem cutters nearly fainted upon discovering it was hollow, filled with crushed rubies meant to be sifted like glowing sand through an hourglass. The message, "Our wealth is so vast, we treat precious stones as children's toys." Centuries later, Henry Roman VIII of England would mimic this tactic, shipping a live polar bear to the French court alongside a note joking that the beast's appetite might yet exceed your majesty's. Beneath the humor lurked a threat. England controlled access to Arctic trade routes France couldn't touch. Modern diplomacy still plays this ancient game, though with subtler props. Where medieval envoys paraded white peacocks through palace gates, today's leaders exchange signed baseball bats or limited edition watches. The underlying calculus remains unchanged. A well-chosen gift can say what treaties cannot. When Japan gave America 3,000 cherry trees in 1912, it wasn't just botany, it was a silent vow of friendship after decades of tension. Yet for all their opulence, these exchanges hid razor-sharp risks. A poorly chosen gift could spark wars instead of averting them. In 1389, a Burmese king's present of 2 albino elephants to Siam was interpreted as a deliberate insult, white elephants being sacred yet ruinously expensive to maintain. The resulting conflict lasted 3 generations, which makes the next tale all the more intriguing because sometimes the most dangerous delivery wasn't a jewel or a beast, but the messenger themselves. The forest swallowed him whole, or so the witnesses claimed. In the winter of 1429, a Burgundian courier named Raynard rode into the dense Ardennes woods carrying a letter that could have rewritten the fate of 2 kingdoms. He never emerged. Search parties found only his horse, its reins tangled in brambles, the saddlebag slit open like a gutted fish. No blood, no body, just the eerie absence of a man who'd vanished between one heartbeat and the next. Historians still spar over Raynard's fate. Some insist he was ambushed by rival agents who burned both message and messenger to ash in some forgotten charcoal pit. Others whisper darker theories that he'd been a double agent all along, slipping away to sell his secrets to the highest bidder, the most haunting possibility. That Raynard simply broke. The strain of constant danger, the weight of too many lives hanging on his next breath, finally drove him to abandon his post and vanish into the anonymous masses. We'll never know. What died with him that day wasn't just a man, but the answer to a pivotal question. Did Duke Philip of Burgundy truly intend to betray his English allies, or was the missing letter a forgery meant to frame him? The ripple effects of such disappearances could topple thrones. When a Scottish herald vanished en route to Norway in 1364, his lost message left King David Roman II waiting in vain for promised Viking mercenaries, a delay that cost him the Battle of Neville's Cross. Centuries later, archivists would discover moldering fragments of the original plea tucked inside a Copenhagen prayer book, suggesting the messenger had reached his destination after all, only to be silenced before he could return. These gaps in the record taunt us with history's might-have-beens, yet for every messenger lost to the shadows, a dozen more were lavishly rewarded. Successful couriers could expect more than gold. They were granted lands, titles, even marriages to minor nobility. After outrunning Moorish raiders to deliver critical troop movements in 1487, Castilian rider Alonso de Molina received a village's worth of olive groves and a coat of arms featuring a winged hourglass. The French King Louis Roman XI once ennobled an entire messenger family, their crest bearing the motto, "Swift as truth." These weren't mere payments, they were propaganda. By elevating messengers to near legendary status, monarchs ensured others would hunger for the same glory. But perhaps the most telling rewards were the seemingly humble ones. A Flemish chronicle records how a nameless courier who warned of a plot against the count's life asked not for coin, but for the right to graze his donkey on castle lawns. The request was granted along with a silver bell engraved with the count's sigil, a token that guaranteed safe passage anywhere in the realm. In an age where trust was scarcer than gold, such symbols carried weight no purse could match. What separates Raynard's story from Alonso's or the donkey couriers isn't skill or courage, it's the cruel randomness of fate. One man's name echoes through time because his message arrived, another's vanishes because a snapped twig betrayed his position. And in that divide, we glimpse the fragile thread on which history so often hangs. For every messenger who vanished without a trace, another found themselves vaulted from obscurity to legend, not just with gold, but with rewards that reshaped their bloodlines. Take the case of Henry de Burges, a low-born courier who in 1442 single-handedly thwarted an ambush meant to intercept his dispatches, fighting off 3 attackers with nothing but a dagger and his saddlebag. The French king was so impressed that he granted Henry a lordship over 6 villages, a coat of arms featuring a galloping stallion, and the right to dine at the royal table whenever he visited Paris. Within a generation, the de Bourges family had married into minor nobility, their descendants becoming diplomats and generals, yet such windfalls were the exception. Most messengers lived and died in near poverty, their pay barely covering the cost of replacing worn-out boots and exhausted horses. Records from Burgundy's court show ordinary couriers earning roughly the same as a stable master, enough for bread and lodging, but little else. Their true payment was often just survival. A Welsh account from 1398 describes a rider named Llewellyn, whose sole reward for warning of an English raid was a pewter badge stamped with the prince's crest, a token that saved him from conscription when recruiters next swept through his village. Better than a sack of silver, he's quoted as saying, "For it keeps my bones whole." The gulf between these outcomes raises a brutal question. Would you gamble your life for the slimmest chance at glory? The risks were astronomical: bandits, storms, the ever-present threat of torture, while the odds of landing a title were thinner than parchment, yet still they rode. Perhaps because for some, even the faintest hope of rising above their station outweighed the dangers, or perhaps because, as the chronicler Jean de Joinville observed, a man who has carried the words of kings begins to walk like one. This hunger for legacy birthed dynasties. Across Europe, certain families became synonymous with messenger work, their names etched in royal ledgers for generations. The Della Rover clan of Lombardy produced 14 master couriers between 1350 and 1500, each trained from childhood in cipher breaking and horseback archery. Their secret, a rigorous apprenticeship where boys as young as 8 memorized routes by scent, learning to navigate blindfolded by the smell of certain pine groves or the iron tang of particular riverbanks. These families didn't just deliver messages, they became living archives of trust. When the Holy Roman Emperor needed to send sensitive word to his Italian allies, he dispatched a Della Rover with the family's signature green wax seal, a mark so respected that even bandits were said to let them pass unmolested. Their loyalty was rewarded with tax exemptions, hereditary titles, and in one case, a papal dispensation allowing them to eat meat on fast days, a nod to the physical toll of their journeys. But even these privileged few walked a razor's edge. For every Della Rover who retired to a country estate, there were dozens who left widows clutching nothing but posthumous commendations. The ledger of the English Royal Post lists one such casualty, Thomas of Hereford, killed by highwaymen in 1411. His epitaph, a single line in the accounts, paid to his widow 1 shilling and 6pence for the horse he owed the crown. Which makes the next chapter all the more remarkable: the rise of a network that sought to protect these riders not through individual heroics, but through sheer, unstoppable numbers. Some families didn't just carry messages, they wove them into their bloodlines, turning courier work into dynasties. The Della Rovers of Lombardy weren't the only clan to dominate the messenger trade for generations. In the misty hills of Scotland, the MacCallum family served as the king's voices for over 2 centuries, their loyalty so unquestioned that Scottish monarchs entrusted them with everything from battle plans to secret marriage proposals. Their advantage, a hereditary knack for memorization. Young MacCallums trained by reciting epic poems backward while balancing on one foot, a drill that honed their ability to deliver verbal messages with pinpoint accuracy, even under duress. One account from 1532 describes how Lachlan MacCallum, captured by English soldiers, recited a 12-page treaty word for word after they burned the original parchment, leaving his captors stunned. But memorization was just the beginning. Messenger dynasties guarded trade secrets like alchemists. The von Ochen brothers of Cologne encrypted dispatches using a cipher based on their grandmother's knitting patterns. a code so idiosyncratic that even court cryptographers couldn't crack it. In Castile, the Mendoza family bred horses with a unique, smooth gait that allowed them to cover twice the distance of ordinary mounts without tiring. Their stables became as legendary as their riders, with rival families offering obscene sums for a single Mendoza-bred colt. Yet these dynasties weren't just collaborators, they were fierce competitors. When the Venetian guild of Couriers caught wind that the Florentine Martelli clan had developed a system of mirror flashes to relay messages across mountain passes, they retaliated by training falcons to intercept the Martelli's carrier pigeons. The resulting feathered wars saw both families spending fortunes on avian espionage until the Pope himself intervened, threatening excommunication for anyone caught arming God's creatures against each other. No rivalry, however, matched the devotion of the Le Sanglier line in France. For 146 years, they served the Valois kings exclusively, their crest, a boar with a scroll in its jaws symbolizing their relentless tenacity. Their signature tactic, rotating teams of riders in relay, fresh horses waiting at hidden way stations known only as Le Réseau du Sanglier. The system was so efficient that a message could travel from Paris to Marseille in 4 days, half the time of ordinary couriers. Their downfall came only when a young Le Sanglier heir, drunk on pride, boasted of the network at a royal banquet. Within months, bandits had razed every way station, proving that even the mightiest dynasties could crumble from a single loose tongue. These families didn't just shape history, they seeped into its art and legends. The Della Rovers appear in frescoes as winged figures hovering over battlefields, while the MacCallums inspired the Scottish ballad, The Rider of the Three Dawns. Even Shakespeare borrowed from their Lord Polonius's advice to Laertes about being true to thine own self, echoes a maxim from the Mendoza family archives. A messenger who lies to himself will soon lie to his king. But parchment and paint could never fully capture their world. For that, we must turn to the silent witnesses, the artifacts they left behind. The medieval world didn't just need messengers, it needed to believe in them. That's why their stories leaped from dusty scrolls into epic poems and towering tapestries, transformed by artists into something grander than life. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales paints the messenger as a figure of swift grace, his horse as lean as a rake, yet tireless, his words sharp as a dagger's point. But look closer and you'll find the cracks in the romance. The same tales whisper of riders who vanish into storms, their cloaks found weeks later wrapped around skeletons. These weren't just characters, they were mirrors held up to a society desperate to make sense of chaos. Tapestries tell an even sharper truth in the famous cloth of St. Jarian, a messenger kneels before a king, his face half-shadowed not in reverence but exhaustion. The embroidery's gold threads catch the light on his tattered sleeves, a silent rebuke to the court's opulence. Compare this to the reality. Ledgers from the same era list couriers' salaries alongside stable hands, their boots patched with scraps. Art elevated them precisely because life did not. Why did these contradictions fascinate audiences? Because messengers embodied the ultimate gamble, that words could triumph over steel. A peasant could outride an army if his message arrived first. A woman disguised as a monk could topple a duke's plans with a single whispered phrase. Their stories let ordinary people dream of bending fate, even as kings reminded them that most messengers died unnamed in ditches. This tension between myth and reality sets the stage for one of history's most startling twists of phrasing, because sometimes the power wasn't in who carried the message, but in how it was written. In 1454, a single misplaced word in a truce document sparked the Battle of Castellan. The original Latin "non" had been smudged, or was it scraped away, turning "the French shall not cross the river" into a deadly invitation. The scribe, a monk who'd never left his scriptorium. The courier, a boy who'd memorized the words but couldn't read them. By the time the error was caught, 10,000 lay dead in the mud, proving that in the right hands, or the wrong ones, even ink could be a weapon. In the flickering candlelight of a scribe's workshop, a single droplet of ink could rewrite history. Take the infamous marriage of the dotted I, a scandal that rocked the courts of Europe in 1471. A hastily penned betrothal contract between the Duke of Lorraine and a Spanish princess contained a tiny, crucial error. The scribe had smudged the Latin word filium daughter into filium son. The Duke, believing he'd secured an alliance with Spain's male heir, mobilized his armies in anticipation. By the time the mistake was uncovered, ships had sailed, treaties had been signed, and the humiliated princess, now deemed damaged goods by court gossips, was packed off to a nunnery. All because one weary scribe's quill had slipped. This wasn't an isolated incident. Medieval messengers knew better than anyone that words were weapons, and in an age without erasers or editing software, every syllable carried lethal precision. A chronicle from the Wars of the Roses describes how a Yorkist messenger deliberately swapped granted for grunted in a royal pardon, turning the king's mercy into a crude insult that reignited hostilities. More chilling still were the knife letters, dispatches where key phrases could be surgically excised with a blade, altering the meaning entirely. A surviving example from Burgundy shows how the phrase, "We shall not attack at dawn," became a death sentence when the "not" was carefully scraped away, the parchment's fibers smoothed over with beeswax. The stakes escalated when religion entered the mix. In 1438, a single misplaced comma in a papal bull excommunicating the King of Bohemia led to a theological firestorm. The original Latin should have read excommunicamus non eum, we excommunicate not him, but the scribe's error rendered it excommunicamus non eum, a negation that accidentally absolved the king. By the time the Vatican issued a correction, half of Europe's clergy were debating whether the mistake was divine intervention. The king, never one to miss an opportunity, declared it proof of his innocence and launched a rebellion that lasted a decade. Yet for all their peril, these linguistic slip-ups also birthed strange opportunities. When a French courier misheard his master's whispered order to burn the mill, brûler le moulin, as kiss the maiden, baiser la molte, the resulting confusion spared a village and allegedly sparked a love match between the messenger and the miller's daughter. Such twists remind us that while words could doom empires, they also left room for the unpredictable, the human. Now consider the creatures who carried messages no human dared to touch, where feathers and fur became the ultimate disguise. When human messengers faced impossible odds, medieval rulers turned to creatures who could fly where no rider dared to tread carrier pigeons. These feathered couriers weren't just birds, they were precision instruments of war and diplomacy. Take the siege of Modena in 1325, where defenders released pigeons with tiny parchment scrolls tied to their legs, each bearing pleas for help. The birds darted through enemy crossbow fire, their homing instincts unshaken by smoke or chaos. One particularly resilient pigeon named Vittoria made the journey 6 times, her arrival at Allied forces marked by the ringing of church bells. She wasn't alone in her heroics. Records from the Siege of Paris in 870 detail how Vikings tried shooting down French pigeons, only to find the birds flew too high and too erratically for their arrows. But pigeons had limitations. They could only return to one pre-established roost, making them useless for two-way communication. And while their speed was legendary, covering 200 miles in a single day, they were vulnerable to storms and predators. The Vatican's prized pigeon loft lost half its birds in 1489 when a sudden hailstorm struck their flight path. Worse still were the falcons trained by enemies to intercept them. The Republic of Genoa employed specialized sky guards, falconers whose birds patrolled the coastlines, plucking messengers from the air. Dogs, on the other hand, offered something pigeons couldn't: discretion. The Burgundian shadow hounds, mastiffs bred for silence and night vision, carried messages in hollowed-out collars across enemy territory. Their training was meticulous. Puppies learned to associate the scent of their handlers' gloves with food, ensuring they'd follow trails days old. A 14th century manual from Toulouse details how dogs were conditioned to ignore livestock and gunfire, their final test being a gauntlet of roasting meat and clanging swords they had to cross without breaking stride. But their greatest weakness was distance. Unlike pigeons, dogs tired. The famed courier hound Gaston reportedly collapsed after 30 miles of non-stop running through the Loire Valley, his paws bloodied but the message still secure in his brass tube. Then there were the ravens, Odin's messengers brought to life. The Danes used them to coordinate coastal defenses, exploiting their intelligence and territorial nature. Ravens could be taught multiple drop points, unlike pigeons, and their black feathers made them nearly invisible at night, but their cunning became their downfall. Chronicles from Ribe Castle tell of a raven named Munin who began hiding messages in tree hollows to delay return trips, earning extra scraps from sympathetic guards. Others grew so accustomed to human food they'd abandon missions to raid kitchens. The decline of animal messengers didn't come from incompetence, but from the relentless march of technology. The printing press made ciphers easier to mass-produce, reducing the need for creatures immune to interrogation. Improved roads and horse breeding created relay networks that outpaced even the swiftest pigeon. By the 16th century, the once prized lofts of kings stood half empty, their feathered occupants reduced to racing hobbies. Yet something irreplaceable vanished when the last war dog retired and the final message-bearing raven took wing. These creatures had been more than tools, they were comrades in a world where trust was scarcer than gold, their loyalty unshaken by politics or greed. Now, as the clatter of the first mechanical printing presses echoed through Europe, a new question emerged. Could cold, gleaming machines ever truly replace the living pulse of wings and paws that had carried empires on their backs? The answer would reshape the world. The clatter of printing presses and the rumble of stagecoaches didn't just change how messages moved, they unraveled an entire way of life. By the 16th century, the medieval messenger's world was vanishing piece by piece. Improved roads, once muddy death traps, became ribbon-straight highways patrolled by armed convoys. Royal postal systems sprouted relay stations every 20 miles, where fresh horses and riders stood ready to whisk dispatches forward with clockwork efficiency. No longer did kings rely on a single heroic courier to brave bandits and blizzards. Now, letters passed through a chain of anonymous hands, each leg of the journey as replaceable as a cog in a machine. The printing press struck the deadliest blow. Why entrust secrets to a lone rider when pamphlets could spread news to thousands overnight? Martin Luther's 95 Theses raced across Europe in weeks, not months, their power lying not in stealth but in sheer ubiquity. Monarchs who once prized messengers for their discretion now feared them as potential leaks. Why risk a man's loyalty when ink could do the work without complaint? The final indignity came with standardized postal rates, reducing the art of message carrying to a mere transaction. A ledger from the London Post Office in 1589 captures the shift, where accounts once listed couriers by name Thomas of Kent for his valor in the storm. Now they coldly noted, item, 1 packet to Calais, 3 pence. Yet something irreplaceable was lost in this efficiency. The new systems lacked the human spark that had turned messengers into legends. No one wrote ballads about postal clerks or printing apprentices. The romance of the lone rider Matilda fleeing through the night, Guillaume dodging arrows faded into nostalgia, repackaged as children's tales. A French poet in 1542 lamented, "We've traded saints for schedules and miracles for mile markers." Even the dangers that once defined the messenger's life became sanitized. Where Mateo had endured torture to protect his cipher, now a broken wax seal was just a clerical error. This shift forces us to ask, do we still value the human touch in communication? In an age of instant digital messages, we've arguably resurrected some medieval dilemmas. Think of encrypted chats or whistleblowers carrying truths across digital frontiers. But the intermediaries have changed. Where once we relied on individuals willing to bleed for their missions, now we trust algorithms and firewalls. There's a haunting symmetry between the medieval messenger stripped of his purpose by the printing press and the modern postal worker eclipsed by email, both casualties of progress. Yet perhaps their legacy lingers in unexpected places. Every time a journalist smuggles footage out of a war zone or a diplomat hand delivers a peace proposal, we catch a glimpse of that old world where words had weight because someone was willing to bear their consequences. The difference: today's messengers rarely wear cloaks or ride horses. They might carry smartphones instead of scrolls, but the stakes and the courage required remain just as high. This brings us to a final global truth. While Europe's messengers fade into history, their counterparts elsewhere were just reaching their zenith. From the snow-streaked passes of the Himalayas to the sun-baked trails of the Sahara, a new chapter was unfolding, one where distance and danger still demanded flesh and blood couriers. Because some messages, it seems, can't be trusted to machines, while Europe's messengers braved blizzards and bandits, their counterparts across the globe were mastering landscapes even more unforgiving and devising methods far older than parchment or pigeons. Take the chasquis of the Inca Empire, sprinting across mountain passes so high that European travelers collapsed from altitude sickness. These relay runners, young men trained from childhood, could cover the length of modern-day Peru in days. Their messages knotted into intricate quipu cords that recorded everything from troop movements to tax records. Unlike European couriers weighed down by armor or cloaks, the chasquis ran barefoot, chewing coca leaves to stave off exhaustion. Stations dotted the Andes every few miles, stocked with fresh runners who'd grab the quipu and dart onward without breaking stride. When Spanish conquistadors first witnessed this system, one chronicler marveled. They move as if the devil himself chases them, yet never drop a single knot. The Islamic world's Bahrid network made Europe's royal posts look amateurish by comparison. Established as early as the 7th century, these routes stretched from Cordoba to Baghdad, with way stations offering not just fresh horses, but translators, scribes, and even physicians to treat injured couriers. Caliphs used the Bahrid to oversee provinces with terrifying efficiency. A governor's rebellion could be reported and crushed within weeks, thanks to riders who crossed deserts at night guided by constellations. Their most ingenious tactic, pigeon posts synchronized with horsemen. Birds carried condensed messages ahead, while riders followed with detailed scrolls, creating a layered system that balanced speed and security. In feudal Japan, shoguns relied on hikyoku, literally flying legs, who wore straw sandals woven with bells to ward off spirits as they raced between Edo and Kyoto. Their endurance became the stuff of legend. One record tells of a hikyoku who ran non-stop for 3 days after a tsunami, his warning saving coastal villages. Unlike European messengers who often traveled alone, Japanese runners worked in teams, passing batons marked with familial crests to prevent forgery. A single broken seal could mean death, a lesson learned tragically in 1615, when a falsified baton provoked a clan war that lasted decades. Yet for all their differences, these messengers shared a universal truth. Their bodies were the ultimate technology. Whether dodging avalanches in the Andes or sandstorms in Arabia, they pushed human limits to keep empires connected. And just like their European counterparts, their names, when remembered at all, were etched into history by sheer audacity. Like the Aztec Painani, who swam across Lake Texcoco with glyphs painted on his skin to avoid capture, or the Mongol Ertuğrul riders who could stitch wounds with horsehair mid-gallop. Their stories whisper a challenge across centuries, that speed and secrecy were once measured not in bandwidth, but in blood and breath. Now, as we near the end of our journey, we turn to those whose deeds transcended duty, the messengers who didn't just deliver history, but became it. From the woman who outran an army with her hair aflame, to the crippled monk whose final words toppled a dynasty, the story of Brother Elias of Clairvaux begins not with a sword's clash, but with a whisper, one that would echo across continents. In the summer of 1146, this unassuming monk arrived at the court of King Louis VII of France, his sandals caked with dust from the roads of Jerusalem. What he carried wasn't a declaration of war or a plea for gold, but a first-hand account so visceral it turned the king's face ashen. The letter described the desecration of holy sites by Seljuk forces, yes, but it was Elias's added testimony, his trembling retelling of Christian women and children sold in Damascus slave markets, of altars smashed into dust, that transformed parchment into prophecy. By the time he finished speaking, the king's hands had clenched into fists, his vow to take the cross ringing through the hall like a war horn. What made this message so incendiary? Unlike dry diplomatic reports, Elias's words fused spiritual urgency with graphic detail. He spoke of flies swarming over unburied pilgrims, of sacred oil mingling with blood in the gutters. But crucially, he framed it as a personal appeal to Louis's kingship and faith. They mock not just Christ, the letter concluded, but every crown that fails to defend him. This was no abstract grievance, it was a challenge to the king's very identity. Within months, Louis mustered an army, igniting the Second Crusade. Historians still debate whether Elias embellished his account, but the result was undeniable. A single messenger's words had mobilized nations. Could a modern dispatch wield such power? Consider how viral footage of war zones today bypasses sterile press releases, cutting straight to the gut. A drone's eye view of rubble, a child's bloodied face, these are our era's version of Elias's testimony, stripping away political calculus to expose raw moral outrage. Yet there's a key difference. Medieval messengers like Elias carried unimpeachable authority. When he swore he'd seen these horrors, no one questioned his authenticity. In our age of deepfakes and algorithmic manipulation, that certainty is shattered. A king no longer trusts his eyes, let alone a stranger's words. Elias never lived to see the Crusade's disastrous end. He died of fever en route to Rome, his body buried in an unmarked grave near Genoa. But decades later, when monks exhumed his remains to transfer them to a proper tomb, they made a startling discovery. Clutched in his skeletal hands was a tiny scroll, likely a psalm, its ink long faded. Yet the gesture spoke volumes. Even in death, the messenger refused to relinquish his duty. Pilgrims soon flocked to his relics, hailing him as the Angel of Clairvaux, proof that some words outlived their speakers. This reverence for messengers transcended borders. In the same century, halfway across the world, a Persian courier named Farhad would earn a different kind of immortality, not for the message he carried, but for the one he took to his grave. Rain fell in icy sheets the night the soldiers came for Brother Arnulf. turning the monastery's courtyard into a quagmire of mud and trampled vows. The young friar had just returned from his most dangerous mission, smuggling letters between besieged Catholic outposts in Protestant-held Strasbourg, and his sandals still bore the stains of 3 river crossings. When the mercenaries kicked in the scriptorium door, he didn't resist. He simply pressed the last unsent parchment into the hands of a trembling novice and whispered, "Swallow it if you must." What happened next would etch his name not just into history, but into the very stones of the chapel where he fell. The soldiers weren't interested in the letters. They wanted the cipher, the key to unraveling the entire Catholic underground network in the region. For 3 days, they alternated between beatings and false kindness, offering Arnulf freedom if he'd just name one contact. According to the novice who survived hidden in a wine barrel, the friar's response never changed. "I carry messages, not memories." On the 4th morning, when the commander lost patience and ordered Arnulf's hands crushed beneath a mortar stone, the chronicles claim the friar looked at his shattered fingers and murmured, "These were never mine to begin with." Martyrdom transformed Arnulf from a mere messenger into something far more potent, a symbol. Within months of his death, pilgrims reported miracles at his grave. Sick children healed after touching the earth where his blood had seeped, barren fields sprouting wheat where his relics passed. The Church, initially hesitant to canonize someone engaged in espionage, eventually bowed to popular fervor. By 1612, Brother Arnulf of the Shattered Hands was officially venerated as the patron saint of couriers, his feast day marked by messengers leaving scraps of parchment at roadside shrines. But peel back the layers of hagiography and a darker question emerges. When does devotion become fanaticism? Arnulf's own letters recovered centuries later from a hidden compartment in the monasteries well reveal a man tormented by doubt. "I fear not the enemy's blades," he wrote to his superior, "but the pride in my own steadfastness." That tension between duty and zeal runs through all such stories. The Byzantine messenger Basil the Stammerer, who let himself be blinded rather than reveal his emperor's secrets, spent his last years warning acolytes, "A message is a tool, not a god." Modern psychology might diagnose Arnulf with pathological obedience, medieval chroniclers with holy conviction. The truth likely straddles both, a reminder that extremism wears many cloaks. Yet something undeniably magnetic lingers in these tales, perhaps because in an age of half-truths and fleeting digital loyalties, the idea of someone valuing words more than life itself feels less like madness and more like a mirror held too close. The real miracle isn't that Arnulf became a saint. It's that 5 centuries later, postal workers in the Alsace region still whisper his name when sorting letters in the pre-dawn dark, not for blessings, but as a reminder that every envelope carries invisible weight. Because the line between martyr and messenger isn't drawn in blood or ink, but in the spaces between the words they refused to surrender. Now consider this: if Arnulf's legacy is veneration, what becomes of those whose sacrifices were swallowed by silence? For every canonized courier, 100 more lie in unmarked graves, their stories crumbling like the parchment they once carried. The click of a send button may seem worlds apart from the thundering hoofbeats of a medieval courier, but the essence remains unchanged: words in motion, hurtling through space to bridge the gaps between us. Today's journalists racing against deadlines to break news, diplomats shuttling between closed-door summits, even the neighborhood postal worker braving sleet to deliver prescriptions, they are all inheritors of that ancient legacy. The tools have evolved from parchment to pixels, yet the core challenges echo across centuries: how to move information swiftly, keep it secure, and above all, prove it can be trusted. Consider the parallels. A medieval messenger's sealed letter finds its counterpart in today's encrypted emails, both designed to thwart prying eyes. The relay stations of the past, where exhausted riders swapped horses, mirror the server farms that bounce our data across continents in milliseconds. Even the dangers persist where bandits once ambushed couriers in mountain passes. Hackers now lurk in digital shadows, intercepting sensitive documents with keystrokes instead of daggers. The stakes are just as high. A misrouted email can tank stock markets. A leaked diplomatic cable can spark international crises. Speed still battles secrecy, just as it did when Jacques the Pilgrim sewed coded messages into his robe. Yet something profound has shifted. Medieval messengers were singular threads in a fragile web. If one failed, the tapestry unraveled. Modern systems thrive on redundancy with backups upon backups. But this safety net comes at a cost. Where a single courier's courage could once alter the course of history, today's messages vanish into vast networks, their human carriers rendered anonymous. We've gained reliability, perhaps, but lost the raw, personal urgency of a Mateo enduring torture or a Matilda cropping her hair to outrun danger. The real magic lies in recognizing these echoes in our own lives. That neighbor who volunteers as a community dispatcher during blackouts, they're the village crier reborn. The friend who hand delivers a condolence letter rather than texting. They've chosen parchment over Wi-Fi, acknowledging that some messages still demand the weight of physical presence. Even our mundane choices, opting for a phone call instead of a tweet, or sealing a love note in an envelope, become tiny acts of rebellion against the disposable nature of modern communication. What endures, then, isn't just the mechanics of messaging, but the unshakable truth behind it. Information only matters if someone cares enough to carry it. Whether etched in ink or etched in light, words only change the world when they're shouldered by people willing to risk something: time, comfort, even safety, to see them through. The medieval messenger's cloak may have become a delivery uniform or a journalist's press pass, but the fire at the heart of the journey burns just as bright. So the next time you sign for a package or refresh a breaking news alert, pause for a heartbeat. Behind every update, every envelope, every ping of notification, stretches an unbroken chain of those who came before: riders who stared down storms, runners who memorized entire treaties, scribes who pressed pens to parchment knowing their words might outlive them. The vehicles change, the valor doesn't. These stories of medieval messengers aren't just relics of a bygone era, they're mirrors held up to our own lives, reflecting truths about courage, trust, and the unbreakable threads that bind us together. Think about it. Every time we hit send on a text or entrust a secret to a friend, we're stepping into the same currents that once carried Jacques the Pilgrim through enemy territory or propelled Matilda of Artois through the night. The stakes may have changed, but the heartbeat of the matter remains. Communication is never just about words. It's about what we're willing to risk to make those words matter. Consider the sheer physicality of their sacrifices. Where we shrug at a dropped call or a delayed email, medieval couriers paid for every mile in blood and blisters. Roland of Provas's mangled feet, Mateo's blinded eye, Arnulf's shattered hands, these weren't just occupational hazards. They were the price of keeping the world connected in an age when silence could mean slaughter. Their suffering forces us to ask, what would we endure to protect the truths we carry? The answer isn't found in grand gestures, but in the quiet choices we make every day: to speak up when it's easier to stay silent, to listen when others are too weary to repeat themselves. Loyalty, too, takes on new dimensions in their shadows. For every Pierre de Clermont who traded secrets for silver, there were 100 nameless riders who chose hunger, cold, and danger over betrayal. Their fidelity wasn't blind. It was a conscious decision to value something greater than themselves. That's a currency we still trade in today, whether it's a whistleblower leaking documents to save lives or a nurse holding a dying patient's hand long after the monitor's flatline. The messengers teach us that trust isn't passive. It's a fire we keep lit against the winds of convenience and fear. But perhaps their most enduring lesson is this: connection is fragile. A storm could drown a plea for reinforcements. A smudged word could ignite a war. A single rider's stumble could topple a dynasty. We like to think our digital age has erased such vulnerabilities, but the reality is more humbling. A misdirected email can still sink careers, a hacked server can still destabilize nations, and a whispered lie can still unravel communities. The difference. Medieval messengers knew the weight of what they carried. They felt it in their aching muscles, saw it in the wax seals of kings, heard it in the way their own breath sounded louder in the dark. That intimacy with consequence is what we've lost and what we desperately need to reclaim, because when communication becomes frictionless, we risk forgetting its power. The messengers remind us that words are never neutral. They can spark rebellions or soothe grief, build bridges or burn them, and the choice of how we wield them, whether carelessly or with the precision of a scribe's quill, echoes far beyond the moment they're spoken. So as we stand at the end of this journey, let's not just marvel at their courage, let's honor it by carrying our own messages with the same fierce intentionality. Because history doesn't just belong to the kings who wrote the letters, it belongs to the ones who dared to deliver them. From Jacques the Pilgrim stitching secrets into his robe to Matilda of Artois cropping her hair and vanishing into the night, these messengers didn't just deliver letters, they wove themselves into the fabric of history. Think of Roland of Provas, his feet shredded to the bone after 50 miles of relentless sprinting, or Mateo of Lombardy, whispering coded falsehoods even as his torturers pressed hot coins to his eyelids. Their stories aren't just adventures, they're testaments to the invisible hands that shaped empires. One misplaced word, one delayed rider, and the Battle of Castellan became a slaughter. One steadfast friar like Arnulf, and an entire resistance network survived. These weren't mere couriers, they were the fragile lifelines between order and chaos. A chronicle from Burgundy in 1458 captures their legacy best. For every king who rules, there are 100 unnamed souls who carried the words that made his reign possible. Their saddles were their thrones, their loyalty the true currency of crowns. That's the heart of it, isn't it? We remember the rulers, the treaties, the battles, but history turned on the grit of those who moved the words. So tell us in the comments which messenger's tale gripped you most. Was it Guillaume, the man angels seemed to shield, or Alay, the blacksmith's daughter who turned prejudice into her armor? And if you're hungry for more hidden histories like these, don't forget to subscribe, because behind every headline, every era-defining moment, there's always someone who dared to carry the message. Here's a question to ponder as you go. Today, our words fly across the globe in seconds, but do we still pause to honor the hands, real or digital, that bring them to us? The mediums have changed, but the miracle of connection remains. And somewhere between the taps on your screen and the ink-stained fingers of the past, the echoes of those riders still whisper, words have weight. Handle them with care.